Founded in 2009, SafeSpace has operated as the only organization prioritizing the needs of sex workers in London. Run by, with, and for sex workers and accomplices. SafeSpace utilizes a peer-driven approach that respects an individual's right to self-determination while advocating for the elimination of systemic oppression. SafeSpace provides a physical space for women and gender non-conforming individuals who face interpersonal and systemic violence to come together, to support one another, and to just be. We have over 40 dedicated volunteers who oversee our drop-in hours, where harm reduction supplies, companionship, food, infant formula, clothing, personal hygiene products are provided. Outside the drop-in hours, peer support is provided by way of court accompaniment, advocacy with organizations, and so on. We also installed a digital hub in SafeSpace offering access to technology like Wi-Fi and assistance with digital literacy.
There are very few and very narrow identities that are imposed on folks who are engaged in sex work and who exchange sex for resources. Those identities imposed onto sex worker include a victim of human trafficking, criminal, or a sexual deviant. When the services of SafeSpace were formally evaluated by those who access the space, what they appreciated most is that the space itself and the relationships formed within allowed people who access to see themselves as something other than a public nuisance. They identified SafeSpace as operating outside of the mainstream social service paradigm, and that they referred to SafeSpace as offering a place to belong, a place where they felt that they were valued in what they were contributed and weren't just seen as a service user.
Sex workers face ongoing harassment, discrimination, threats and violence, even within a gender equality movements. For those who may not be able to read the text on this slide, let me highlight 2 sentences for you. I don't see any effort from your organization to better their lives in the least, and you're doing nothing but normalizing their misery. Close your fucking doors and find another privileged middle-class venture. This message is an example of the lateral violence we have experienced within gender equality movements. We're often accused of not being the right kind of feminist because we provide community to folks entering, working in, or looking to exit sex work. We believe sex work can be exploited and that it can be empowering. Sex work can drastically limit life opportunities or be one of the only ways to earn a living wage and open up possibilities. A member of SafeSpace described our space like this.
If they are scared to go to the hospital or anything, there's just that beforehand space where they can make decisions, or where they can catch up on their thoughts. Life and death situations where they can make life or death choices.
We look out for each other. Many who are now coordinators and volunteers at SafeSpace started off at accessing SafeSpace. Some of us are chosen family. We have attended births of our fellow community members, held a dying member's hand, celebrated important goals achieved, and accompanied each other during court appointments to lend strength in difficult situations.
In our community-based research, where the findings have recently been published in the Journal of Social Work and Public Health, people who access this space shared openly about what their relationships are with other community organizations where they access services. They spoke to the need to perform roles in order to access services. They spoke to the need to know the systems within the systems to even begin to know how to start navigating the systems. They talked about being a statistic to fit an agency's agenda or quota. They talked about the need to perform to be the right kind of victim. They talked about how they didn't fit neatly into categories of people who were homeless or people who were experiencing interpersonal violence. So they didn't fit into what it was like according to the intake criteria of other services that were out there. They talked about being infantized. They talked about their stories being erased, being spoken for, and being spoken over. When we conducted the needs assessment, people who accessed the space talked about that SafeSpace was a place where they could access free from other people's judgments and their efforts to reform, rehabilitate, or rescue them. SafeSpace enables people who are accessing to see themselves as more than the identity of a sex worker. People who access this space reported that SafeSpace creates a sense of belonging, of community, of family, where their choices to engage or not engage in sex work are always respected, and that any resources that can enhance personal safety and dignity are freely given without question. What do people who access this space state is most useful?
What's really useful? Actions that suggest I have value. Since you were there consistently when you said you were going to be, I was able to like gain trust, and you didn't judge me. So you didn't like fuck that up. Because it's really easy for me to be like, no, I hate you. A space where I could feel like it's not completely safe, if not completely safe, then surrounded by people who had a good head on their shoulders and knew how to deal with situations that weren't safe. Like, there's a difference between being safe and feeling safe.
People who access our space will talk about how they feel policed in both formal and informal ways in public spaces. This becomes even more heightened during the pandemic that we're living through, where there's a heightened sense of who is permitted to be in public spaces, when and why, and the limitation on the amount of people who gather. So people who access the space talk about the ways that they are formalized, policed, so systematic regulated forms of policing. They talk about things like moratoriums on licensing of facilities, and they talk about bylaws that operate municipally that make it difficult for them to have safer working conditions. They talk about the ways that they are informally policed by fellow citizens when they move about public space, and how they're always subject to scrutiny about whether or not they are legitimized to be in that space. There was a big accomplishment that just happened yesterday in St. John's. They talked about an organization who's been working really tirelessly called Safe Harbor Outreach Project. They've been working to lobby the city of St. John's to lift the moratorium on the ban, so a ban on licensing of adult establishments. They have, in their own words, been working tirelessly raising awareness about how these actions, like these bans, create conditions that are criminalized, that prohibits and restricts them from working in legal and regulated options that are indoors. And instead, what it does is increase the unregulated sex work that is occurring, pushing sex workers out into the streets, into the shadows, and more precarious situations where they work. These kinds of prohibited actions, according to SWAP, do not actually address the real violence that occurs in the sex trade, but meaningful and ongoing conversations with sex workers, allies, and accomplices would help us make our communities more safe for people who are engaged in sex work or who are exchanging sex work for resources. And there's been lots of talk within the context of this pandemic about moving our language away from social distancing and calling it instead physical distancing or physical isolation. But until you've stood away from another person at 6 feet and watched them break down in tears because they know that as soon as you pass their goods to them, their donation, their requested need, that their contact with you will end, and that is the end of their social engagement, please don't use your experiences to speak for our community. So call it what you will, our experiences don't reflect your experiences don't reflect those in our community, where as soon as there is physical distancing, there is social distancing. And when you do this, when you say that it's not social distancing, that it's just physical distancing, and you can get in contact with each other through technology or through virtual spaces, you ignore the realities that for our community, our space is a gathering space where relationships are formed when we gather together, and they're not able to be sustained if we are not in physical proximity together. SafeSpace is a gathering space, and quotes from community members who access our space speak to this.
It also serves as a place for women to come when they don't have a compass or they're like lost with no direction, and you guys can give them a compass. And from someone else. I think if I were to be completely honest, before I was in that space, I probably never had a positive relationship in my life, like a healthy, positive relationship. And I've learned that since then, that's probably like one of the most valuable things anyone can do for anyone is make a model for a healthy relationship with them. Sex work is work. For many, it's a means to survive, like any other means of learning and income under capitalism. And it often involves close bodily contact with other human beings. For those who work in clubs and massage parlors, workspaces are closed down. If sex work was decriminalized and destigmatized as a first step, workers could qualify for funding like any other worker with lost wages, who are doing their best to squeak out a living when social distancing is urged as a necessary hardship to flatten the curve. So where does criminalized income streams leave workers with zero worker protections and choices more than ever between life and death? When you include a metric for program success as the stopping or reduction of doing sex work, you reinforce the idea that there's something inherently wrong with sex work. You perpetuate the stigma that the work is the problem instead of focusing on the conditions that create harm. The focus and resources gets directed at criminalizing activities. Yet nowhere in our community has an increased police presence ever meant better outcomes. We can't arrest our way towards living with enhanced safety and dignity. Maggie's partnered with Butterfly to discuss sex work amidst of COVID-19, producing this guide, which takes a harm reduction approach, recognizing that it's not feasible for all sex workers to cease working in midst of a global pandemic. This guide discusses tips for sex workers, clients, third parties, and allies looking to make their work safer and the precautions to consider taking on the job.
How people access our space now is radically different than how we gathered before this pandemic. So just to give you a sense of the process, when somebody comes to access our space, they stand on an X in the parking lot. A volunteer who will be wearing gloves and who will be masked will greet them in the parking lot and record down. So we don't share pens and pads of paper. We'll record down the requested needs. That volunteer will then go back, pass off through the door to another volunteer who's in gloves and a mask, who will take that requested needed item, look around the space, and hope to fill the requested needs in a plastic bag that gets tied up, passed back to the volunteer that's outside, and passed back to the person who is accessing our space. And after a particularly busy and emotionally difficult shift that Julie and I were on last week, we wrote this reflection together, trying to compare and contrast the perspective from both somebody who is accessing the space and somebody who is a holder of the space. I stood outside to have a moment to see it from your eyes. Once a home, now an X marks my spot. It's the line between me and you.
I'm sorry I can't hug right now. I'm sorry I can't let you in. I'm sorry I keep telling you to stay 6 feet apart and to stay back from the door. And again, to stay back from the door. I'm sorry I don't have juice for you, a can of soup, toilet paper, or the right size sexy lingerie. I'm sorry you can't come in right now, even just quick to use the washroom. I'm sorry I'm wearing these gloves and this stupid mask. It's not me, it's not you I'm trying to protect myself from. It's me I'm worried about infecting you. I'm so sorry we can't hug right now. I'm so sorry.
We have been reminded during this current pandemic that if you really want to know how good your response is, that it's best not to be talking with the people that are around the table only, but really important to be talking with the people who are locked outside of our community spaces. And so that's what we've been doing. We've been paying attention to the people who are accessing our services, and they are saying time is of the essence, that people are getting caught up in the bureaucratic red tape. And just like for the past 10 years, it is our community, it are people just like you that are helping us keep our doors open and are helping to ensure that we have things that people need when they show up at our doors.
If you're interested in supporting SafeSpace, we are still accepting donations at this time. For updates on how to get those donations, what's being accepted and what's not, please check out our Facebook page. We're keeping it up to date. And e-transfers can always be sent to our email address. Like Jodi said, For 10 years, we were sustained only by volunteer and funded only by community. And it's times like these we realize that's critical to our existence. It's the reason why we're still open all of our regular days right now when so many services around us are shutting down.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.